A single room, they said, just for the night, but even before sundown, nothing went as planned. The train wheezed to a stop at the lonesome station, its iron wheels grinding against frost-covered rails. Steam billowed into the December air, mixing with the snow that had been falling since dawn. Mara Callahan gathered her worn traveling case and stepped down onto the platform, her boots crunching on fresh powder. Aspen Hollow wasn't much to speak of a mountain town carved out of wilderness, where timber mills and trappers made their living against nature's harsh hand. The station stood at the edge of it all, a weathered building that seemed to lean against the wind. Beyond it, she could make out the main street stretching toward the mountains, lined with false front buildings and smoking chimneys. Miss Callahan, a man in a thick wool coat, approached, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I'm Samuel Hendricks from the Northern Mill. Wasn't expecting you till tomorrow's train." "The schedule changed in Denver," Mara replied, adjusting her gloves against the bite of winter. "I hope it's not an inconvenience." "No trouble at all, though." Hendricks rubbed his beard, looking troubled. "There's been a mishap at the boarding house. Chimney fire took out half the rooms yesterday. Mrs. Donnelly's still got one room available, but it's already spoken for." Mara felt her heart sink. She'd traveled 2 days from Chicago, changing trains 3 times, all for this bookkeeping position. The thought of spending a night in the station waiting room made her shoulders sag with exhaustion. "There must be somewhere," she said, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. "Another boarding house, a family willing to rent a room." Hendricks shook his head. "Not with this storm coming in. Most folks are battened down tight, but—" He paused, considering. "Let me talk to Mrs. Donnelly. Maybe we can work something out." The walk to the boarding house took them down Main Street, past the general store where men loaded supplies onto sledges, past the saloon already glowing warm with lamplight, though it was barely past 4 o'clock. The boarding house sat on a corner lot, a 2-story structure with gingerbread trim that seemed out of place among the rough-hewn buildings surrounding it. Inside, the parlor smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. Mrs. Donnelly, a stout woman with graying hair pinned severely back, looked up from her ledger as they entered. "Samuel," she said, then noticed Mara. "This the new bookkeeper." "Miss Mara Callahan," Hendricks said. "Just arrived from Chicago. We've got a situation with the rooms." "Mrs." Donnelly's face showed genuine regret. "I'm awful sorry. Miss, that chimney fire left me with just the one room, and Mr. Boon's already paid for the week. He's one of our timber cruisers, been staying here while he scouts the northern sections." "Perhaps Mr. Boon would consider," Hendricks began. "But Mrs." Donnelly was already shaking her head. "Man pays his rent prompt and keeps to himself. I won't turn him out into this weather." Mara set down her case, feeling the weight of the journey in her bones. Through the window, she could see the snow falling heavier now, the street already disappearing under white. "What about just for tonight?" she asked quietly. "Surely by tomorrow something else might open up." "I wouldn't ask, but—" "Mrs." Donnelly studied her, taking in the travel dust on her coat, the weariness in her eyes. "You come all this way alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "No family, no husband?" "No, ma'am. Just the job at the mill." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "That's a hard thing, traveling alone, especially for a woman." She drummed her fingers on the ledger, thinking. "The room's got 2 beds. Used to rent it to traveling partners before the fire. If Mr. Boon agrees to it, and that's a mighty big if you could share for the night, but I won't force it on him." Mara felt heat rise to her cheeks. Share a room with a strange man. Everything proper in her rebelled against the idea, but the alternative was nowhere to sleep in a strange town with a blizzard approaching. "I understand," she said carefully. "If Mr. Boon would consider it, I would be grateful. And of course, I'd pay my share." Mrs. Donnelly stood. "He's due back shortly. Always returns before dark. You can wait in the parlor, have some tea. When he arrives, we'll put it to him straight." The next hour passed slowly. Mara sat near the fire, accepting Mrs. Donnelly's tea gratefully, trying not to think about what she was proposing. Back in Chicago, such an arrangement would have ruined her reputation entirely. But this wasn't Chicago. This was the frontier, where different rules applied, or so she hoped. She'd left everything behind for this chance, her small room above the millinery shop where she'd worked since she was 16, the disapproving looks when she'd studied accounting in the evenings, and most recently, the memory of Thomas declaring she was too serious for any man to want. That still stung, even after 6 months. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and snow. The man who entered had to duck slightly under the doorframe. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat dusted with snow. His face weathered from wind and sun. Dark hair fell past his collar, and his eyes, a shade of gray like winter sky, swept the room before settling on Mrs. Donnelly. "Mr. Boon," the landlady said, "we have a situation I need to discuss with you." He noticed Mara then, giving a slight nod before turning back to Mrs. Donnelly. "Ma'am?" "This is Miss Callahan. She's come to work at Hendrick's Mill, but with the fire damage, we're short on rooms. She needs a place for the night." Calder Boon's expression didn't change, but Mara saw his jaw tighten slightly. "I see. Your room has 2 beds. Mrs. Donnelly continued. "If you'd be willing just for tonight to share the space, Miss Callahan would pay half the rate, and we'd work to find her other accommodations tomorrow." The silence stretched out. Mara forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to appear calm and respectable despite the awkwardness of the situation. "You traveled alone?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. "Yes, sir, from Chicago." "That's a long way." "It is." He studied her for another moment, then looked toward the window where the snow continued to fall. "Storm's getting worse, temperatures dropping fast." "Mr. Boon," Mara said, standing. "I understand this is irregular. If you're not comfortable with the arrangement, I'll find another solution. Perhaps the church—" "Church is 3 miles out," he interrupted. "You'd freeze before you got halfway there." He pulled off his gloves, considering. "One night. Just one night," Mrs. Donnelly assured him. "Tomorrow we'll sort something proper." He nodded slowly. "All right then, but there'll be rules, clear boundaries." "Of course," Mara said quickly. "I'm grateful for your consideration." "Don't be grateful yet," he said. "Let's see how the night goes." Mrs. Donnelly showed them upstairs, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The room was simple but clean, 2 narrow beds separated by a small table, a washstand, a single chair by the window. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, already glowing with warmth. "I'll send up extra blankets," Mrs. Donnelly said. "Supper's at 6 in the dining room." She gave them both a meaningful look. "I trust you'll both conduct yourselves properly." When she left, the silence felt heavy. Calder set his pack near the bed by the window, clearly his established spot. Mara placed her case near the other bed, trying to take up as little space as possible. "I usually take supper in my room," he said. "But tonight might be better if we eat downstairs. Keep things proper." "Yes, of course." He moved to tend the stove, adding wood with practiced efficiency. "You picked a hard time to come west, Miss Callahan. Winter's brutal up here." "The position couldn't wait until spring," she replied. "Mr. Hendricks needs someone to set his books straight before the government contracts come due." "You're a bookkeeper, then?" "I am trained in Chicago." She lifted her chin slightly. "I'm very good at what I do." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I don't doubt it. Takes courage to travel this far alone for work." He straightened from the stove. "I'll give you privacy to settle in. Half an hour before supper." After he left, Mara sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she'd agreed to. One night, sharing a room with a stranger, if anyone back home knew. But she wasn't back home. She was here, in Aspen Hollow, starting fresh. Whatever happened tonight, she'd face it with the same determination that had brought her this far. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them all inside as surely as any locked door. Whatever the morning brought, first she had to make it through the night. The supper hour passed quietly in the boarding house dining room. Other lodgers, 2 traveling salesmen, and an elderly widow kept to themselves, stealing occasional glances at the unusual pair. Mara focused on her beef stew, acutely aware of Calder's presence across the small table. He ate methodically, saying little beyond asking her to pass the salt. When they climbed the stairs afterward, the awkwardness seemed to follow them like a shadow. The room felt smaller than before, the 2 beds suddenly too close together despite the space between them. "I'll step out while you prepare for the evening," Calder said, already reaching for the door handle. "That's kind of you," Mara replied, grateful for his consideration. He paused at the threshold. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be in the parlor." Alone, Mara changed quickly into her nightdress and wrapper, then set about arranging her few belongings. From her case, she pulled out her sewing basket, a necessity she never traveled without. Her everyday dress had torn at the hem during the journey, and mending would give her something to focus on besides the strange situation. When Calder knocked softly 20 minutes later, she called for him to enter. He seemed to fill the doorway, bringing with him the scent of pipe tobacco and winter air. "I'll keep to my side," he said, moving to his bed. "Won't be any trouble." Mara settled into the chair by the window with her sewing, angling it to catch the lamplight. The storm had picked up, snow hitting the glass in sharp taps. She threaded her needle, trying to ignore how conscious she was of every sound, the rustle of pages as Calder opened a book, the creak of his bed as he sat down, the pop of wood in the stove. "What are you reading?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He held up the volume. "Manual on Sustainable Timber Practices. Dry as sawdust, but necessary if we want these forests to last." "You're a conservationist." "I suppose you could say that. Can't keep cutting trees like there's no tomorrow. Someone's got to think about what comes after." It wasn't what she'd expected from a frontier timber cruiser. "That's progressive thinking." "Maybe, but it's also practical. A forest stripped bare doesn't help anyone." He watched her work for a moment. "You're quick with that needle." "Years of practice. My mother taught me before she passed. Said a woman should always be able to mend what's torn." Wise woman. They lapsed into silence again, but it felt less strained. The lamp cast a warm glow over the room, creating a small circle of light against the storm outside. Mara found herself stealing glances at him as she worked. He read with intense concentration, occasionally making notes in the margins with a pencil. "May I ask you something?" she ventured after a while. He looked up. "Go ahead. Why did you agree to this arrangement? You could have refused." He closed the book, considering. "Would have been easy to say no. Simpler. Certainly. But I've spent enough nights in these mountains to know what cold can do. Couldn't have it on my conscience, turning someone out into this weather. Even a stranger, a woman traveling alone. Especially then." He set the book aside. "Takes courage to leave everything behind for work. Not many would do it." Mara felt her throat tighten slightly. "Some would say it's foolishness, improper for a woman to pursue such independence." Some would be wrong. The simple statement hung between them. Mara bent back to her sewing, but her hands trembled slightly. After Thomas's harsh words about her ambitions, hearing such matter-of-fact acceptance felt almost overwhelming. "I should tell you," she said quietly, "in the interest of honesty, that this position at the mill is everything to me. I studied for 3 years, working days and studying nights, to learn proper bookkeeping. Everyone said it was man's work, that I should focus on finding a husband instead. And yet here you are. Here I am. She managed a small smile. Though sharing a room with a stranger wasn't quite in my plans. Life rarely follows our plans. Miss Callahan, the mountains taught me that early. She finished the hem and folded the dress carefully. The wind howled outside, rattling the window frame. The temperature had dropped noticeably, frost already forming on the inside of the glass. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked. 7 years, give or take. Came west after... He stopped, shook his head. Came west seeking something different. Found it in these woods. There was a story there. She could tell, but she didn't press. Everyone who came west seemed to carry some past they'd rather leave unspoken. "I should retire," she said, suddenly aware of the impropriety of sitting in her wrapper conversing with him. "It's been a very long day." "Of course," he stood, moving to tend the stove one last time. "I'll be up a while yet reading. I'll keep the lamp low." Mara slipped into bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the sheets smelling of lye soap and winter air. She lay rigid, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement from across the room. "Miss Callahan." "Yes." "You can relax. I give you my word, you're as safe here as you would be in your own home." Something in his tone, quiet and certain, eased the tension in her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Boon." She closed her eyes, listening to the storm outside and the quiet turn of pages, the strangeness of the situation lying in a room with an unknown man, in a town she'd never seen before this day, with her whole future uncertain should have kept her awake. But exhaustion was stronger than anxiety, and the warmth of the room was soporific. "Mr. Boon," she said drowsily. "Yes." "What brought you in from the forest tonight, Mrs.? Donnelly said you've been staying here all week." "Supply run. Need equipment checked before heading to the high country. Winter surveying requires preparation. You go out in this weather." "Weather doesn't stop for logging contracts. Neither can I." She thought about this man who spent his days alone in frozen forests, who read about conservation by lamplight, who'd given up his privacy tonight for a stranger's sake. "That must be lonely work," she murmured. "Sometimes, but solitude's not the same as loneliness." "What's the difference?" She heard him shift, maybe considering his answer. "Solitude's a choice. Loneliness is what happens when the choice gets taken away." The profound simplicity of it settled over her like an extra blanket. She'd felt lonely in Chicago, surrounded by people who couldn't understand her dreams. But here, in this strange shared room with snow falling outside and a thoughtful stranger reading by lamplight, she felt less alone than she had in months. "Good night, Mr. Boon," she whispered. "Good night, Miss Callahan. Sleep well." And, surprisingly, she did. The last thing she remembered was the steady whisper of turning pages and the comfortable crackle of the fire, creating a peaceful rhythm that carried her into dreams. Across the room, Calder looked up from his book to watch the snow fall. He'd grown used to solitary evenings, had even come to prefer them, but tonight felt different somehow. The presence of another person, her quiet breathing, the faint scent of lavender from her soap changed the character of the room entirely. He'd been truthful about solitude versus loneliness. What he hadn't said was that sometimes the line between them blurred, especially on nights like this when the snow fell heavy and the world felt very far away. Having someone else here, even a stranger, eased something he hadn't realized was tight in his chest. Tomorrow she'd find other lodgings. Tomorrow they'd go back to being strangers who happened to work for the same company. But tonight, with the storm sealing them in and the fire burning low, they shared this small, warm space against the cold. He read until the lamp oil ran low, then banked the fire carefully and prepared for bed. In the darkness, he could hear her steady breathing, occasionally interrupted by the settling of the building or the crack of ice against the window. "Just for tonight," she'd said. He lay back against his pillow, staring at the ceiling. wondering why that thought brought an unexpected twinge of regret. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Aspen Hollow, but inside the small room, two strangers slept peacefully, separated by a few feet of floor and united by the simple human need for shelter from the cold. The power went out just after sunset, plunging the boarding house into darkness. Mrs. Donnelly appeared at their door with candles, explaining that the storm had taken down lines throughout the town. "Kitchen's closed too," she said apologetically. "Can't cook without the electric stove working. I'm afraid it's cold fare for everyone tonight." After she left, Mara sat in the flickering candlelight, trying not to think about her empty stomach. She'd barely touched her noon meal on the train, and now supper seemed impossibly far away. Calder moved to his pack in the corner, rummaging through it with purpose. "Can't offer much," he said, producing several wrapped bundles. "But I always carry provisions. Habit from the trail." He laid out his supplies on the small table: dried beef, hard biscuits, a tin of preserved peaches, and a jar of what looked like soup concentrate. "It's not fancy, but it'll fill a stomach." "I couldn't take your food," Mara protested, even as her stomach gave an audible growl. "It's sharing, not taking," he corrected, already dividing the portions. "Besides, can't have you fainting from hunger on your first night in Aspen Hollow. What would Hendricks say?" He produced a small camp pot from his pack and set about mixing the soup concentrate with water from the pitcher. The pot went on top of the stove, and soon the scent of beef broth filled the room. "You're very prepared," Mara observed, accepting a piece of dried beef. "Spend enough nights in the wilderness. You learn to never know when a trail shelter might be empty or a storm might pin you down." He handed her some biscuits. "These are harder than granite, but if you soak them in the soup, they're manageable." They ate in companionable quiet, sharing the simple meal by candlelight. The soup was basic but warming, the dried beef tough but satisfying. Mara found herself relaxing, the formal distance of the dining room replaced by something more genuine. "Tell me about Chicago," Calder said, passing her the tin of peaches. "What made you leave?" Mara considered her words carefully. "Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's expectations?" "Can't say I have. Been running from expectations most of my life." She smiled at that. "Well, I spent 10 years trying to meet them, working at the millinery shop, attending church socials, learning all the proper things a young woman should know." She paused, spearing a peach slice. "But in the evenings, I studied accounting, borrowed books, attended lectures when they'd allow women in. Everyone said I was wasting my time." "Everyone?" "My employer, my landlady, the other girls at the shop." She set down her spoon. "And Thomas, the man I was walking out with. He said no man wanted a wife who thought she was smarter than him. Said I was too serious, too plain, too ambitious." Sounds like Thomas was a fool. The blunt assessment startled a laugh from her. "That's what I decided. Eventually. But it took time. When you hear something enough, you start to believe it. So you came west instead." "So I came west." She met his eyes across the table. "Where being too serious might actually be an asset." "It is," he said simply. "These mountains don't care about church socials or proper expectations. They only care if you can do the work." "And can I do the work? I mean, everyone seems surprised a woman would come alone for such a position." Calder leaned back, considering. "I've seen all kinds come through these towns. Some make it, some don't. Has nothing to do with being man or woman, far as I can tell. Has to do with grit." He studied her. "You traveled 2 days alone through winter to get here. That's grit." They finished the meal, and Calder insisted she take the last of the peaches. As Mara helped clear the simple dishes, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. This was the kind of conversation she'd craved in Chicago direct, honest, without the elaborate dance of propriety. "May I ask you something in return?" Calder said, settling back with his pipe. You don't have to answer. That seems fair. What do you hope to find out here besides the job? I mean, Mara returned to her chair, pulling her shawl closer. The question deserved an honest answer. Space, she said finally. Space to be more than what others expect, to use my mind for something worthwhile, to build something of my own. She paused. Does that sound foolish? No, sounds like why most of us came west. He struck a match, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered features. I came seeking the same, in a way, space to breathe, work that mattered, silence to think in. And did you find it? Most days. He drew on his pipe, the tobacco glowing red. Though sometimes the silence gets heavy, that's the trade freedom for solitude. You said before that solitude was a choice. It is, doesn't mean the choice is always easy. They sat quietly, listening to the wind howl outside. The candles created a small sphere of warmth and light, holding the darkness at bay. Mara found herself studying his face in the dim light, the lines around his eyes that spoke of sun and wind, the careful way he held himself, as if always ready to move. What made you choose conservation? She asked. It seems unusual for someone in the timber trade. My father was a logger back in Maine, he said. Saw whole forests disappear in my childhood. Streams that ran clear turned muddy, then dried up entirely. Wildlife vanished. By the time I was grown, the land was used up. Worthless. He tapped his pipe against the stove. When I came west, I saw the same thing starting. These forests are magnificent. Miss Callahan, some of these trees are older than memory. Seemed wrong to let greed destroy them. So you map them, catalog them. I survey for sustainable cutting. Find areas that can be harvested without destroying the whole. Mark the old growth that should be preserved. Try to make the bosses understand that leaving some standing means having timber for our grandchildren. Do they listen? Sometimes, when it makes financial sense. That's why someone like you matters. Good books, honest accounting, proof that conservation can be profitable, numbers they can't argue with. Mara hadn't thought of her work in those terms before. I never considered that bookkeeping could serve a greater purpose. Everything serves a purpose, if you look at it right. He stood, stretching. Storm's getting worse, temperatures dropping fast. We'll need more wood for the night. While he tended the stove, Mara noticed him favoring his left shoulder slightly. Are you injured? Old complaint. Get stiff in the cold. Logging accident years back, brother dropped his end of a saw. Caught me wrong. Your brother's a logger too. Was... The single word carried weight. Died in a mill accident 3 years ago. Another reason I believe in doing things safer, smarter. I'm sorry. So was I. Still am. He adjusted the damper on the stove. But grief's a luxury out here. Work still needs doing. Mara understood that kind of practical sorrow. My mother died when I was 15. Consumption. I kept sewing her patterns for years after, like she might come back to check my stitches. Did it help? Some days, other days it just made the missing worse. He nodded, returning to his chair. That's the truth of it. Grief comes and goes like weather. The candles had burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. The boarding house creaked and settled around them. Other lodgers long since retired. I should thank you, Mara said quietly, for sharing your meal, for the conversation. It's been a long time since someone talked to me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. No thanks needed. Been a long time since I had company worth talking to. He met her eyes. Most evenings I read until I can't keep my eyes open, just to fill the quiet. Tonight's been different, better. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared solitude. Mara felt it like a physical thing, delicate as frost on glass. She'd expected awkwardness, even danger, from this forced proximity. Instead, She'd found an unexpected kinship. "We should sleep," she said, though she was reluctant to end the evening. "You have work tomorrow, and I need to meet with Mr. Hendricks about the position." True enough, but he made no immediate move to prepare for bed. "Miss Callahan." "Yes." "Whatever Thomas told you back in Chicago, he was wrong. Dead wrong. Don't let his small thinking follow you out here." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. "Thank you," she whispered. They prepared for sleep with the same careful courtesy as the night before, taking turns with privacy, maintaining appropriate distance. But as Mara lay in her narrow bed, listening to the storm and Calder's quiet breathing, she felt something fundamental had changed. She'd shared a meal with a stranger, talked of dreams and grief by candlelight, and found understanding where she'd least expected it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges finding lodging, starting her position, proving herself capable. But tonight, in this small room with the storm raging outside, she felt less alone than she had in years. "Good night, Mr. Boon," she said softly into the darkness. "Good night, Miss Callahan. May your dreams be peaceful." As sleep claimed her, Mara thought she heard him add something else, too quiet to make out, but perhaps it was just the wind, singing its lonely song through the rafters of the boarding house, while two solitary souls found comfort in their brief, unexpected companionship. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows with such force that Mara startled awake. Lightning illuminated the room in harsh flashes, revealing rain mixed with snow pelting the glass. The storm had transformed into something fiercer, winter and spring battling for dominance in the mountain sky. She sat up, heart racing, disoriented in the darkness. Another boom of thunder shook the building, and she heard the ominous sound of water dripping somewhere above. The roof-old wood and tar paper was struggling against the assault. "It's all right," came Calder's calm voice from across the room. "Buildings weathered worse." As her eyes adjusted, she could make out his silhouette by the stove. He was feeding wood into it, the orange glow casting shadows across his face. The dripping sound intensified, and she realized water was beginning to seep through a corner of the ceiling. "Should we alert Mrs. Donnelly?" she asked, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "She knows. Happens every spring when the snow melts too fast." He placed a tin bucket under the leak. "These old buildings have their complaints." Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake her bones. Mara pulled her knees to her chest, feeling foolish for her fear but unable to control it. She'd weathered storms in Chicago, but nothing like this raw display of nature's power. "You're safe," Calder said, his voice gentle. He moved to his pack, pulling out an oil lamp. "Thunder can't hurt you, it's just noise." "I know that," she said, then jumped as another crash sounded directly overhead. "My mind knows it. Anyway." He lit the lamp, warm light pushing back the darkness. "First mountain storm is always the hardest. The peaks catch weather different than the flatlands. Amplifies everything." The drip in the corner became a steady stream. Calder calmly placed a second container beneath it, as if this was perfectly normal. His unruffled demeanor helped steady her nerves. "How long have you lived in places like this?" she asked, needing conversation to distract from the storm. He settled into the chair, close enough to tend the fire. 7 years in these mountains. Before that, 2 years in the Colorado Territory, year in Wyoming." He paused, calculating. "Near about 10 years of frontier living, all told." "Always alone?" "Mostly. Had a partner for a while in Colorado. Good man, but he got gold fever and headed to California. Haven't heard from him since." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 hammers. Mara shivered despite the warmth from the stove. "What made you choose such solitude?" she asked. "Surely there were other options after your brother's accident." Calder was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. Sometimes a man needs distance from what hurts him. The woods don't ask questions. Don't expect explanations. They just are. But don't you miss having people around conversation connection? I go into town regular enough. Talk to the mill folks, the other surveyors. It's not complete isolation. That's not the same as real companionship. He looked at her then, the lamplight catching something vulnerable in his expression. No, it's not. He stood, checking the water buckets. What about you? You left everything behind. Family, friends, whatever life you'd built. That's its own kind of solitude. Mara considered this. I suppose it is, but it felt necessary. Like I was suffocating in Chicago, trying to be someone I wasn't. And who are you, Miss Callahan? When you're not trying to be someone else, the question hung in the air between them. Thunder rolled across the mountains, but it seemed distant now, less threatening. I don't know yet, she admitted. That's part of why I came west, to find out. He nodded slowly. That's honest. Most people pretend they have all the answers. Do you have answers? Some learned a few things in these mountains. He adjusted the damper on the stove. Learned that silence can be healing or harmful, depending on why you seek it. Learned that running from something doesn't mean you've escaped it. Learned that a man can be surrounded by beauty and still feel empty. And are you empty? He met her eyes again. I was, for a long time, built walls out of solitude. Told myself it was strength. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. But tonight, sharing soup with you, talking like this, I remember what I've been missing. The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Mara felt her breath catch. This man, so contained and careful, was offering her a glimpse behind his armor. I've been empty too, she whispered. Even in crowded rooms, especially in crowded rooms. Everyone talking, but no one really saying anything. Yet, here we are. Two strangers in a leaking room, speaking truths. Strange how that happens. Maybe not so strange. Sometimes it's easier to be honest with someone you'll never see again. The words stung more than Mara expected. Of course. He was right. Tomorrow she'd find other lodging. Their paths might cross at the mill. But this unexpected intimacy would end with the storm. I suppose that's true. She managed. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face. I didn't mean. He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. That came out wrong. No, you're right. This is temporary. Everything's temporary. Miss Callahan doesn't make it less real. The philosophy of it settled over her. She watched him tend the fire, noting the careful way he moved, the quiet competence that spoke of years of self-reliance. She wondered what he'd been like before grief drove him to the mountains. Tell me about the forests, she said, wanting to return to safer ground. What's it like, spending days among those ancient trees? His expression softened. It's like walking through a cathedral, the big pines and firs, some of them 300 years old or more. The way light filters through the canopy, the silence that's not really silence birds, wind, the creak of wood. Every tree has its own character, its own story. You speak of them like they're alive. They are alive, more alive than most people realize. They talk to each other through their roots, share nutrients, warn about disease. A forest is a community, not just a collection of timber. And you map this community. I try. Mark the heart trees, the old ones that support the others. Find the natural clearings where cutting won't destroy the system. It's like being a translator between two worlds that don't speak the same language. The passion in his voice transformed him. This wasn't the taciturn man who'd reluctantly agreed to share his room. This was someone with purpose, with vision. Your brother, Mara ventured carefully. Would he have understood your work? Sam, Calder smiled sadly. No, Sam saw trees as money standing vertical. Used to joke that I'd gone soft, caring more about bark than bills. But he was a good man, just practical, had a wife and babies to feed. You have family, then nephews or nieces?
2 nephews, 1 niece, back in Maine with their mother. I send money when I can.
Another facet of this complex man. Mara found herself hungry to know more, to understand how someone could hold such solitude and such care in the same heart. Thunder rumbled again, but farther away now. The storm was passing, leaving steady rain in its wake. The leak had slowed to a manageable drip. You should try to sleep. Calder said, morning comes early, storm or no storm.
I don't think I can. Not yet.
He studied her, then moved to his pack again. I have something that might help. He pulled out a worn book. Poetry. Don't laugh, it helps on restless nights. You read poetry? Man needs something beautiful in the wilderness. Can't live on technical manuals alone. He handed her the book. Wordsworth. Fitting for a mountain storm. She opened it carefully, noting the marginalia in pencil, the worn pages. This book had traveled far. Would you read something aloud? He looked surprised, then pleased. If you'd like. Taking the book back, he found a marked page. His voice, deep and measured, filled the room. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. The familiar words took on new meaning in his voice. In this place. Mara closed her eyes, letting the poetry wash over her, mixing with the sound of rain and the crackle of fire. When he finished, the room felt different, softer somehow, despite the bare walls and simple furniture. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, he replied. Been a long time since I shared that with anyone. They sat in companionable silence as the storm continued its retreat. Finally, Mara returned to her bed, feeling strangely reluctant to close her eyes. She wanted to hold on to this moment, the unexpected gift of connection in the midst of a storm.
Mr.
Boon.
Yes. I'm glad it was you. In the room. I mean, when I had nowhere else to go.
She heard him shift in the darkness.
So am I, Miss Callahan. So am I.
As sleep finally claimed her. Mara thought she understood something new about loneliness and solitude, about the walls people build and the moments that breach them. The storm had revealed more than leaks in the roof. It had shown her that even the most solitary souls sometimes ache for connection, and that sometimes, if they're fortunate, they find it in the most unexpected places. The rain continued through the night, but gentler now, like a lullaby against the windows. And in the small room, 2 people who had thought themselves destined for aloneness slept peacefully, no longer quite so solitary as they'd been just hours before. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Mara woke first, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling. Then, remembering where she was, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline stillness that made the world seem newly made. She turned carefully, not wanting to disturb the quiet, and saw Calder's bed was empty. His pack was gone, boots absent from their place by the door. For a moment, disappointment settled heavy in her chest. He'd left without saying goodbye. Rising, she dressed quickly in the cold room. The fire had died to embers, and her breath misted in the air. She was folding her nightdress when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, familiar. The door opened and Calder entered, carrying an armload of split wood. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat. "You're awake," he said, seeming pleased. "Thought I'd get the fire going before you rose."
I thought you'd gone,
she admitted, then felt foolish for saying it.
Just to the woodshed.
He knelt by the stove, arranging kindling with practiced hands.
Mrs. Donnelly's up too, says she'll have breakfast ready within the hour.
The fire caught quickly, warmth beginning to push back the chill. Mara busied herself packing her few belongings, trying not to think about what came next. The intimacy of the past 2 nights felt fragile in the morning light, like something that might shatter if examined too closely. "I'll speak to Hendricks today," she said, keeping her voice businesslike, "about lodging arrangements. I'm sure something can be found." "About that." Calder stood, dusting off his hands. "I've been thinking." She waited, hands stilling on her packing. "The northern camp where you'll be working, they've got an old supply cabin that's been sitting empty. It's rough, needs work, but it's shelter, close to the office where you'll be keeping books. A cabin alone. It's small but sound, has a good stove, solid roof. The camp cook, Mrs. Hollowell, lives nearby. She'd keep an eye out, make sure you're settled." He paused. "It'd give you independence, your own space." The offer was practical, sensible. Yet Mara heard something else in it, a solution that would place her close to where he worked, in the orbit of his daily travels.
"That's very thoughtful,"
she said carefully. "Would the company approve such an arrangement?"
"Already asked Hendricks when I saw him at the mill this morning. He's agreeable if you are. Says a bookkeeper on site would be convenient."
"You spoke to him already. It's barely past dawn." "I don't sleep much." He moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. Habit of early rising. She joined him at the window, standing careful inches apart. The town looked transformed by snow, all sharp edges softened, imperfections hidden under white. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me, have no obligation." He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe because I remember what it's like to arrive somewhere with nothing but hope and determination. Maybe because—" He turned to face her. "Because these past 2 nights reminded me that isolation isn't always strength. Sometimes it's just fear dressed up as independence." The honesty of it took her breath away. "And you're not afraid anymore?" "I'm terrified." The admission came out rough. "But I think maybe that's the point. Being afraid and choosing connection anyway." They stood there, the morning light between them, everything unsaid hanging in the air like visible breath. Mara felt herself balanced on a precipice, unsure whether to step back or leap. "The cabin," she said finally. "I'd like to see it." Relief crossed his features. "After breakfast, I could show you the way, help assess what needs fixing." "I'd appreciate that." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Mrs." Donnelly's voice called out. "Breakfast is served, if you're decent." They descended together, the dining room already filling with a smell of bacon and biscuits. Other lodgers glanced at them with curiosity, but Mara held her head high. Let them speculate. She'd done nothing shameful. They ate quietly, surrounded by the chatter of traveling men and the clatter of dishes. But Mara was intensely aware of Calder across the table, the way he handled his coffee cup, the careful way he buttered his biscuit, the occasional glance he sent her way. After the meal, they set out through the snow-covered streets. The storm had left nearly a foot of new snow, but paths were already being cleared by shopkeepers and residents. The air was sharp and clean, painful in the lungs, but somehow purifying. The northern camp sat a mile outside town, a collection of buildings nestled against the forest edge. Men were already at work, the sound of saws and axes ringing through the cold air. Calder led her past the main buildings to a small cabin set slightly apart. "There she is," he said. "Not much to look at, but solid." The cabin was tiny, one room with a lean-to addition, but the logs were well chinked, the roof appeared sound, and someone had put in glass windows rather than oiled paper. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through those windows. "It needs cleaning," Mara said, turning slowly to take it in. "And furniture. But oh," she moved to the window that faced the forest. "Look at that view." Pine trees stretched as far as she could see, their branches heavy with snow. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of work from the camp. "The stove works," Calder said, checking the chimney. "I can help you get it cleaned and supplied. There's a pump outside for water, and the privy's just there, behind those trees." It's perfect, she said, and meant it. After years in cramped boarding house rooms, the idea of her own space, however humble, felt like wealth. You sure it's isolated out here? Town's a fair walk in bad weather. I'm sure. She turned to face him.
When could I move in?
Give us today to clean it proper. You could be settled by tomorrow if you're willing.
Us.
Mrs. Hollowell already volunteered to help when she heard a woman bookkeeper was coming. She's starved for female company out here. He smiled slightly. Fair warning, she talks enough for 3 people. They spent the next hour making lists what needed cleaning, what supplies were required, what repairs couldn't wait. Calder was thorough, practical, noting things Mara wouldn't have thought of. When they finally emerged, the sun was high and warming despite the snow. I should get you back to town, he said. You'll need to make arrangements, purchase supplies.
Yes.
But she didn't move, reluctant to break whatever spell held them here, at the edge of the forest with the cabin waiting behind them.
Miss Callahan Mara.
Her name on his lips was soft, uncertain. I want you to know, my offer of help comes with no expectations, no obligations.
I know,
she interrupted gently.
I understand.
Do you? He stepped closer, his expression earnest. Because I need you to know that whatever happens next, these past 2 nights they've meant something to me.
To me as well.
The words were barely a whisper. They walked back to town in companionable silence, the snow crunching beneath their boots. At the boarding house, Calder paused at the door. I'll come by tomorrow morning with a wagon, 8 o'clock. I'll be ready. He touched the brim of his hat, a formal gesture at odds with the warmth in his eyes. Until tomorrow, then.
Until tomorrow.
Inside, Mara found Mrs. Donnelly in the parlor, working on her ledgers. The older woman looked up with knowing eyes.
Found lodging, have you?
Yes, the cabin at Northern Camp. Mrs. Donnelly's expression was unreadable. That'll set tongues wagging. A young woman alone out there. I'm not afraid of gossip.
No, I don't suppose you are.
She closed her ledger. Mr. Boon's a good man. You know, quiet, keeps to himself. But good, not many would have shared their room as he did, proper-like. He's been very kind. Kind? Mrs. Donnelly snorted. Child, I've run this boarding house for 15 years. I know the difference between kindness and something more. Heat rose to Mara's cheeks.
I don't know what you mean.
Don't you?
Well, perhaps that's for the best. Take your time figuring it out.
She stood, patting Mara's shoulder.
Just remember out here, we make our own rules.
What matters in Chicago or Boston doesn't always signify in the territories. That night, alone in the room that had briefly been theirs, Mara packed her few belongings and tried to make sense of the past 48 hours. She'd come to Aspen Hollow expecting to start a job, to prove herself capable. Instead, she'd found something else entirely, a connection she hadn't sought, a possibility she hadn't imagined. Tomorrow she'd move to her own cabin, begin her work, establish her independence. But tonight, as she lay in the narrow bed where just last night Calder had read poetry in his deep voice, she admitted to herself that something fundamental had shifted. She'd shared a room with a stranger, and in doing so, discovered she might not want to be strangers anymore. Whatever tomorrow brought, that truth would remain, warm as a banked fire in her chest, patient as the mountains themselves. The cabin at Northern Camp became Mara's haven. Within a week, she had transformed the dusty space into something warm and welcoming. Mrs. Hollowell, true to Calder's prediction, had arrived the first morning with mops, buckets, and enough chatter to fill the forest.
Lord have mercy. It's good to have another woman here,
she'd declared, attacking cobwebs with vengeful enthusiasm.
These men don't understand the need for proper conversation.
My Herbert, bless him, thinks 20 words is a speech. Now, 2 weeks into her residency, Mara sat at the small table she'd acquired from camp surplus, ledgers spread before her. The morning sun streamed through clean windows, illuminating columns of figures that told the story of the timber operation. She'd already found several errors in the previous bookkeeping, money lost to poor arithmetic and worse record-keeping. A knock at her door interrupted her calculations. She opened it to find Calder standing there with a bundle of split kindling. "Morning," he said, his breath misting in the cold air. "Thought you might be running low." "Thank you." She stepped aside to let him in. "Though you know I'm perfectly capable of splitting my own wood." "I know." He stacked the kindling by the stove. "But I was passing by." He'd been passing by quite frequently, she'd noticed, bringing firewood, checking her stovepipe, making sure the pump hadn't frozen, always with a practical reason, always maintaining careful propriety, but present in a way that had become the rhythm of her days. "Would you like coffee?" she offered, as had become their custom. "Mrs. Hollowell brought fresh grounds yesterday." "If it's no trouble." She poured 2 cups from the pot, keeping warm on the stove, and they settled at the table, the ledgers between them like a chaperone. "Finding everything in order?" he asked, nodding at the books. Hardly. The previous keeper seemed to think mathematics was more suggestion than law. She showed him a column of figures. "This alone represents nearly $50 in errors, all in the company's disfavor." Hendricks will be grateful. He suspected something was off, but couldn't prove it. "Well, now he can." She made another notation. "I should have preliminary reports ready by week's end." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence. These morning visits had become precious to her brief moments of connection before the day's work claimed them both. Calder would head into the forest with his surveying equipment, and she would lose herself in numbers and receipts. But for these few minutes, they existed in the same space. "I'll be gone for a few days," he said suddenly, "surveying the high country before the next storm system moves in." "Oh." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. Should be back by Friday if the weather holds." "Be careful. Mrs. Hollowell says the high passes can be treacherous." "Always am." He stood, preparing to leave, then paused. "Would you, that is, when I return, would you consider having supper with me in town? The hotel serves a decent meal, and it would be proper, public." The invitation hung between them. In 2 weeks of careful friendship, this was the first suggestion of something beyond neighborly assistance. "I would like that," she said softly. His smile transformed his weathered face. "Friday evening, then. If I'm not back by dark, don't wait." "You'll be back." "How can you be sure?" "Because you're a man who keeps his promises." After he left, Mara tried to return to her work, but concentration eluded her. She found herself gazing out the window toward the tree line, already missing his presence. It was foolish, this attachment that had grown so quickly. Yet she couldn't deny it, nor did she want to. That afternoon, Mrs. Hollowell arrived with fresh bread and gossip. "That Calder Boon's been mighty attentive," she said, settling her ample frame into the other chair. "More social in 2 weeks than in 2 years previous." "He's been kind," Mara said carefully. "Kind, Mrs." Hollowell laughed. "Dear girl, men don't trudge through snow daily to be kind. That man's smitten." "We're friends." "Friends who share long looks and morning coffee." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've seen how he watches you when he thinks no one's looking, like a man seeing water after a drought." Mara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's not. We haven't—" "Oh, I know you haven't. Calder Boon's too honorable for anything improper. That's what makes it all the more telling." She patted Mara's hand. "Nothing wrong with it, dear. Man like that needs someone to thaw his frozen heart. And you need someone who sees you as more than just a bookkeeper." That evening, Mara walked to the edge of the forest, watching the sun set behind the peaks. The camp was quieting, men returning to their bunkhouses. smoke rising from chimneys. She'd built something here, not just a home, but a place in the community. The men tipped their hats when they passed. Mrs. Hollowell had adopted her like a daughter, and Hendricks sang her praises to anyone who'd listen. And then there was Calder, careful, considerate Calder, who brought her firewood and shared her morning coffee, who'd offered her shelter that first night and continued to offer smaller shelters of friendship, of understanding, of possibility. She thought about his invitation to supper, such a simple thing in any other context, but here it felt momentous, a public declaration that their connection was more than mere neighborliness. The next 3 days passed slowly. Mara threw herself into the books, uncovering more discrepancies, organizing systems that would prevent future errors, but her mind kept wandering to the mountains, wondering where Calder was, whether he was safe. Mrs. Hollowell noticed her distraction. "He's weathered worse than this," she said Wednesday afternoon, finding Mara staring out the window. "That man knows these mountains like his own reflection." "I'm not worried," Mara lied. "Course you're not. That's why you've been checking the tree line every 10 minutes. Thursday brought snow, light but steady. Mara worked by lamplight, trying not to think about Calder somewhere in the high country, possibly trapped by weather. She'd lived independently for years, prided herself on not needing anyone. When had that changed? She knew exactly when 2 nights in a shared room, conversations by candlelight, poetry read in a voice like aged whiskey. Connection formed not from passion but from recognition, 2 solitary souls finding their match. Friday dawned clear and bright. Mara rose early, unable to pretend she wasn't anxious. She dressed with more care than usual, then chided herself for vanity. It was just supper, just 2 friends sharing a meal. But her hands trembled as she pinned her hair. She was reconciling supply invoices when she heard it whistling from the tree line. She knew that tune, had heard Calder humming it during his morning visits. Her heart leaped as she moved to the window. He emerged from the forest, pack on his back, surveying equipment in hand. Even from a distance, she could see his smile when he spotted her at the window. He raised his hand in greeting, and she waved back, not caring who might see. An hour later, he knocked at her door. He'd cleaned up, shaved, worn what appeared to be his best shirt under his coat. "You came back," she said. "I promised, didn't I?" "How was the surveying?" "Productive. Found a section of old growth that needs protecting. Hendricks won't like losing the timber, but I'll make him understand." He offered his arm. "Shall we? I've reserved a table for 6 o'clock. They walked to town together, her hand tucked properly in the crook of his elbow. The hotel dining room was warm and well lit, filled with the prosperous citizens of Aspen Hollow. Heads turned as they entered the reclusive surveyor and the lady bookkeeper, sharing a public meal. "Let them look," Calder murmured, sensing her tension. "We're doing nothing wrong." They were seated at a corner table, far enough from others for private conversation. The meal was simple but good: roasted beef, winter vegetables, fresh bread. But Mara barely tasted it, too aware of the man across from her, of the statement they were making simply by being here together. "Tell me about the mountains," she said, needing the comfort of familiar conversation. "What you saw up there." His face lit up as he described the high country frozen waterfalls like crystal cathedrals, meadows sleeping under snow, the tracks of elk and mountain cats. He drew maps on the tablecloth with his finger, showing her secret valleys and hidden groves. "I'd like to show you someday," he said. "In summer, when the wildflowers bloom, it's like nothing you've ever seen. I'd like that. The promise of summer, of a future beyond these winter weeks, warmed her more than the dining room's fire." They lingered over coffee and pie, neither wanting the evening to end, but eventually, propriety demanded they leave. Calder walked her back to the cabin, their pace deliberately slow. At her door, they paused. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the cold sky. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called.
"Thank you," Mara said, "for supper, for everything. Thank you for accepting."
He stood close but not too close. Proper even now.
"Mara, I need to tell you something."
She waited, heart racing. "These past weeks, having you here, sharing morning coffee, watching you make this place a home, it's changed things. Changed me." He took a breath. "I don't want to presume, don't want to rush anything, but I want you to know that my intentions, my feelings, they're serious."
"Calder."
His name was all she could manage. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Whatever you're comfortable with, whatever pace you need, I'll match it. But I'm not a man who does things halfway. When I commit to something, it's with everything I have." She reached out, touched his hand.
"I know. It's one of the things I
admire about you." He turned his hand, fingers interlacing with hers. For a long moment, they stood there, connected by that simple touch, while the winter night held its breath around them. "Good night, Mara," he said finally, squeezing her fingers gently before letting go.
"Good night, Calder."
Inside, she leaned against the closed door, heart pounding. Through the window, she watched him walk back toward town, his tall figure silhouetted against the snow. At the tree line, he paused and looked back, raising his hand in a final farewell. She pressed her fingers to the glass, already counting the hours until morning coffee, until their careful courtship could continue. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. Ready for him, ready for the possibility of a life shared rather than merely survived. The cabin that had started as a refuge had become a home, and the man who'd shared his room for one strange night had become so much more, had become her future, if she was brave enough to claim it. The woman arrived on the morning stage from the southern camp, her burgundy traveling dress and elaborate hat marking her as someone who didn't belong to the rough timber settlements. Mara watched from her cabin window as the coach stopped near the main office, disgorging its single passenger. Even from a distance, the woman was striking tall, graceful, with auburn hair artfully arranged. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to admiration, picking her way delicately across the muddy ground. Mara returned to her ledgers, but concentration proved difficult. Something about the woman's arrival unsettled her, though she couldn't say why.
"When Mrs.
Hollowell bustled in an hour later, face flushed with excitement and news. Mara's unease deepened. "You'll never guess who's come calling," the older woman announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "Rosa Lynn Beaumont, all the way from the southern camp. Says she's here on business, but I'll eat my Sunday hat if that's the whole truth." "Who is Rosa Lynn Beaumont?"
"Mrs."
Hollowell's eyes gleamed with the joy of one about to impart significant gossip. Only the woman who had Calder Boon wrapped around her little finger 2 winters past, left him cold when some mining executive came through with deeper pockets. She settled into her chair with obvious relish. Course, that didn't work out like she planned. Man turned out to be married already. Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She and Calder were engaged. Not formally, but everyone expected it. He was different than more social, came to dances and such. Rosa Lynn had him dancing attendance like a trained bear.
"Mrs."
Hollowell shook her head.
"When she left, he retreated into those woods of his. Haven't seen him at a social gathering since, until you came along."
The morning's work held no appeal now. Mara found herself watching the paths between buildings, dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She didn't have long to wait. Just before noon, she saw them Calder's familiar tall frame beside Rosa Lynn's elegant figure. They stood near the supply shed, Rosa Lynn's gloved hand on his arm, her face tilted up toward his, even from her window. Mara could see the woman's practiced charm in every gesture.
"Don't torture yourself, Mrs."
Hollowell said softly, appearing at her shoulder. "Man's got a right to his past."
"Of course he does."
Mara turned away from the window.
It's none of my concern.
But her hands shook as she returned to her desk, and the numbers swam before her eyes. When a knock came at her door an hour later, she knew who it would be. Calder stood on her threshold, hat in hand, his expression troubled. Behind him, at a respectable distance, waited Rosa Lynn. "Mara," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling. "I'd like you to meet someone. Miss Rosa Lynn Beaumont, from the Southern Camp. Rosa Lynn, this is Miss Mara Callahan, our bookkeeper." Rosa Lynn glided forward, extending a gloved hand with regal grace. "Miss Callahan, I've heard so much about you." Her smile was perfect, her tone honey-sweet, but her green eyes assessed Mara with sharp calculation. "Miss Beaumont," Mara kept her own tone neutral. "Welcome to Northern Camp. How quaint your little cabin is," Rosa Lynn observed, her gaze taking in the simple furnishings with barely concealed condescension.
"So rustic. You must miss the comforts of city life." "Not at all. I find it quite comfortable."
"How brave of you." Rosa Lynn turned to Calder.
"Remember that little cottage we used to dream about? Cal with roses around the door and proper parlor furniture."
Calder's jaw tightened.
"That was a long time ago, Rosa Lynn." "Not so long."
Her laugh tinkled like false silver.
2 years is nothing between old friends.
Mara watched the interplay, noting Calder's discomfort and Rosa Lynn's persistent familiarity. The woman was beautiful, accomplished, everything Mara wasn't. Next to her elaborate dress and polished manners, Mara felt plain and practical as her brown work dress. "I should return to my books," Mara said, needing escape. "Good day, Miss Beaumont, Calder." She closed the door before either could respond, leaning against it as she fought for composure. Through the window, she watched them walk away. Rosa Lynn's hand once again on Calder's arm, her animated chatter carrying on the wind. The afternoon dragged endlessly. Mara forced herself to work, but her mind kept wandering to Rosa Lynn's possessive touches. The pet name Cal, the shared memories of cottages and dreams. When evening came without Calder's customary visit, the message seemed clear. She was preparing a lonely supper when another knock interrupted. This time, Calder stood alone, his face grim.
"May I come in?"
She stepped aside wordlessly. He entered, seeming to fill the small space with his agitation. "I need to explain," he began without preamble. "About Rosa Lynn. You owe me no explanations. Your past is your own." "Don't," his voice was rough. "Don't close me out. Not you." The raw pain in his tone stopped her retreat. She gestured to the chairs by the stove.
"Would you like coffee?"
"No.
Yes, I don't know."
He ran his hand through his hair. A gesture she'd learned meant deep distress.
"I should have told you about her.
I thought it was finished. But it's not. It is for me. Has been since the day she left." He sat heavily. "But Rosa Lynn has a way of rewriting history to suit her purposes." Mara poured coffee despite his confusion, needing the familiar ritual.
"She's very beautiful."
"Like a poisonous flower." The bitterness in his voice surprised her.
"Beautiful to look at, deadly to touch."
"You loved her." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "I thought I did, but what I loved was an illusion, the woman I thought she was, not who she actually was." He accepted the coffee, wrapping his hands around the cup. She played a part brilliantly, the devoted sweetheart, eager to build a life together, right up until James Morrison came through with his gold mine money. Mrs. Hollowell mentioned something about that.
"Did she mention how Rosa Lynn tried to come back when Morrison's wife appeared?
Suddenly remembered how much she'd always loved me?" His laugh was harsh. "I was done being anyone's second choice." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. "Finally," Mara asked.
"Why is she here now?"
"Supposedly to negotiate timber contracts for the southern operation. But Rosa Lynn never does anything without 3 ulterior motives." He set down his cup, leaning forward. She saw us in town, at the hotel. Word travels fast between camps. Understanding dawned. She's here because of me, because I'm courting you. Yes. He met her eyes directly. She can't stand to see me happy with someone else. It's not love, it's pride. She thought I'd pine forever. And did you pine? For a while, until I understood that losing her was a gift. He stood, moving closer. Mara, I need you to know. Another knock interrupted. Rosa Lynn's voice called sweetly, Cal, are you in there? I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I seem to be lost. Mara saw Calder's hands clench. She rose, smoothing her skirts. Let her in. Mara. Let her in. I won't hide. He opened the door. Rosa Lynn stood there, having somehow gotten mud on her expensive boots and a carefully crafted expression of helpless distress on her face. Oh, she exclaimed, as if surprised. Miss Callahan, I didn't realize. Cal, I was just looking for you to escort me back to town. These woods are so confusing in the dark. The path is clearly marked, Mara said calmly. And it's barely dusk. Rosa Lynn's eyes flashed before resuming their innocent wideness. Perhaps for someone accustomed to such rustic conditions. But I'm just a simple woman who needs protection. Simple, Calder muttered under his breath. I'll walk you back, Mara announced, surprising everyone, including herself. I need to post some letters in town anyway. That's not necessary, Rosa Lynn began. I insist. Mara collected her shawl and correspondence with brisk efficiency. Calder, thank you for clarifying those timber calculations. I'll have the reports ready tomorrow. She saw his quick understanding, the gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Miss Callahan. I'll come by in the morning to review them. The walk to town was silent, except for Rosa Lynn's increasingly desperate attempts at conversation. Mara responded with polite monosyllables, refusing to be drawn into whatever game the woman was playing. At the boarding house, Rosa Lynn turned with a swish of skirts. You think you've won something, she said, dropping all pretense. But you don't know him like I do. Cal needs beauty, passion, excitement, not some plain little bookkeeper playing house in a shack. Perhaps, Mara said evenly. He needs someone who stayed, someone who chooses him first, not as a fallback when better options fail. Rosa Lynn's face flushed. How dare you? Good evening, Miss Beaumont. I hope your business concludes quickly so you can return to the southern camp. Mara turned and walked away, head high, leaving Rosa Lynn sputtering on the boarding house steps. The walk back was darker, but Mara didn't mind. She felt lighter somehow, clearer, at her cabin. She found Calder waiting, pacing her small porch. That was masterful, he said without preamble. The look on her face. I shouldn't have engaged. It was petty. It was perfect. He stepped closer. Mara, I need you to understand something. Whatever Rosa Lynn and I had, it was shadows and smoke. But this what's growing between us, it's real, solid as these mountains. I know, she said simply. Do you? Because if she's made you doubt. Mara stopped his words with a raised hand. She's made me certain, seeing you together, watching how you are with her versus how you are with me. There's no comparison. No, he agreed. There's not. They stood on the porch, the night gathering around them. Through the trees, lamplight from the camp buildings created pools of warmth in the darkness. She'll try again, Mara warned. She's not used to losing. Let her try. Calder's voice was firm. I know what I want, who I want. The declaration hung between them, as clear as the stars beginning to appear overhead. Mara felt something settle in her chest, a certainty that matched his own. Come for coffee tomorrow, she asked. Our regular time. Nothing could keep me away. After he left, Mara prepared for bed with a lighter heart. Rosa Lynn would make trouble, that was certain. But Mara had faced down worse than a spurned beauty's wounded pride. She'd crossed a continent alone, built a life from nothing, earned respect through merit rather than beauty. Tomorrow, Rosa Lynn would likely deploy new strategies. But tonight, Mara slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that some things, true things, real things, couldn't be stolen by pretty faces or calculated charms. In her dreams, she heard Calder's voice again, solid as these mountains, and knew he spoke truth. The alarm bell rang out across the northern camp just past midnight. Mara jolted awake, momentarily confused by the clanging that cut through the winter night. Then she smelled its smoke, acrid and close. She threw on her wrapper and boots, rushing outside to see orange flames licking at the supply warehouse on the camp's eastern edge. Men poured from the bunkhouses, some still in their union suits, all racing toward the fire with buckets and shovels. "The water barrels!" someone shouted. "Form a line from the creek!" Mara joined the effort, taking her place in the bucket brigade that quickly formed. Her hands were soon numb from the freezing water, but she didn't stop. The warehouse held crucial supplies tools, provisions, medicine. Losing it would cripple the camp's operations. Through the smoke and chaos, she searched for Calder. He'd be here, nothing would keep him from helping. She finally spotted him near the building itself, part of the group trying to pull salvageable goods from the structure. Then she heard a cry from inside the warehouse. "Someone's in there!" a man yelled. "I heard voices!" Without hesitation, Calder plunged into the smoke-filled building. Mara's heart seized. She wanted to run after him, but strong hands held her back. "Let the men handle it." "Mrs." Hollowell said, appearing at her elbow. "You'll only be in the way." Endless seconds passed. The fire grew fiercer, fed by tar paper and dried goods. Just when Mara thought she couldn't bear it another moment, figures emerged from the smoke, Calder half carrying, half dragging two younger men who'd been trapped when a beam fell. They collapsed on the snow, coughing and gasping. Calder's left leg was bleeding through a tear in his trousers, and one of the rescued men appeared to have a broken arm. "Get them to the medical cabin," Hendricks ordered. "Johnson, ride for Doc Martin in town, fast as you can." Mara followed as they carried the injured to the small building that served as the camp's infirmary. Calder tried to wave off attention, insisting the others be seen to first, but Mara could see how heavily he was favoring his injured leg. "Sit," she commanded, guiding him to a cot. "Let me look." "It's nothing, just a scrape." She knelt and carefully rolled up his trouser leg, revealing a deep gash along his calf. "This needs stitching." "Doc Martin will handle it when he arrives." "That could be an hour or more." She rose, moving to the medical supplies. "I can clean and bind it temporarily, unless you'd prefer to bleed all over, Mrs. Hollowell's clean floors." He managed a weak smile. "When you put it that way." She worked quickly, drawing on skills learned from her mother. The wound was ugly, but clean. No debris embedded in it. As she washed and wrapped it, she was intensely aware of his eyes on her face. "You're good at this," he said softly. "Mother was often called to help with injuries in our neighborhood. I learned by watching." She tied off the bandage. "This will hold until the doctor arrives, but you must keep still." "Mara," his hand caught hers. "Thank you." "You foolish, brave man," she whispered, rushing into a burning building like that. "Had to. Those boys, they're just kids. Really, came west to make their fortune, same as everyone." He squeezed her fingers. "Couldn't let them die for a moment's carelessness." The doctor arrived within the hour, praising Mara's field dressing before setting to work properly stitching the wound. The two rescued men were worse off, one with that broken arm, the other with serious burns on his hands, but all would recover. Mara stayed through the night, helping the doctor, fetching water and bandages, offering comfort where she could. When dawn broke pale and cold, she was exhausted but couldn't bring herself to leave. "Go rest," Calder urged from his cot. "You've done enough." "I'll rest when you do." Stubborn woman. Pot calling the kettle black. Despite everything, he chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled his stitches. Hendricks appeared in the doorway, his face grave. Lost the warehouse, but saved most of the supplies. Could have been much worse. He looked at Calder. That was brave work. Foolish, but brave. Just did what anyone would do. No, Hendricks said firmly. Not anyone. Those boys owe you their lives. After he left, Mara finally allowed herself to sit on the edge of Calder's cot. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her shaky and overwhelmed. Hey, Calder said gently. We're all right. Everyone's all right. When you went into that building, she couldn't finish. I know. He reached up, touched her cheek with careful fingers. I'm sorry I frightened you. Don't be sorry. Just don't do it again. Can't promise that, but I can promise to always try to come back. She leaned into his touch, too tired and emotional to care about propriety. They stayed like that for a long moment, drawing comfort from simple contact. Over the next days, Mara divided her time between her bookkeeping duties and the infirmary. The camp had rallied around the injured men, everyone contributing to their care. She read to them, wrote letters for the one whose hands were too bandaged to hold a pen, and kept Calder company during his enforced rest. You'd make a fine nurse, Doc Martin observed on his third visit. Ever consider it? I'm happy with my ledgers, Mara replied, but I'm glad to help where needed. That's the frontier spirit. Everyone pitches in, does what's necessary. He rebandaged Calder's leg with practiced efficiency. You're lucky. Boon. Inch to the left and that beam would have caught an artery. After the doctor left, Calder was unusually quiet. Mara sat nearby, mending one of his shirts torn in the fire. What are you thinking? She asked. About luck, chances, how quickly things can change. He shifted on the cot, grimacing. That could have been the end, just like that. But it wasn't. No, but it made me think about time, how we assume we have plenty of it, but really we don't know. He met her eyes. I don't want to waste any more time, Mara. Her needle stilled. What are you saying? I'm saying that when I was in that building, when I thought I might not make it out, my only regret was that I hadn't told you properly how I feel. He struggled to sit up straighter. I love you. I've been falling in love with you since that first night at the boarding house, and I don't want to wait for some perfect moment to say it. The shirt slipped from her nerveless fingers. Calder. You don't have to say it back. I know it's fast, know you might need more time, but I needed you to know. Life's too uncertain for silence. Mara rose, moving to sit carefully beside him on the cot. That night, when you shared your meal with me, when you read poetry in the storm, I started falling then too. She took his hand. I love you too, despite my best efforts to be sensible about it. His smile was radiant. Nothing sensible about love. No, she agreed. Nothing sensible at all. He pulled her down for a kiss there first, sweet and careful with his injuries, but full of promise. When they separated, both were breathless. What happens now? Mara asked. Now I heal. Then I court you properly. Then, when you're ready, I ask you to marry me. He grinned at her shocked expression. I told you, I don't do things halfway. That's quite a plan. Is it one you might be amenable to eventually? She thought about her life before the loneliness, the struggle to be taken seriously, the sense of never quite fitting. Then she thought about these past weeks' morning coffee, shared conversations, the feeling of home she'd found not just in the cabin, but in his presence. Yes, she said simply, eventually. When you're healed, when we've had time to court properly, as you said. I can wait as long as you need. Just don't go rushing into any more burning buildings in the meantime. I'll do my best. They sat together as the morning light strengthened, hands entwined, planning a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Outside, The camp was rebuilding, clearing away the fire damage, stronger for having weathered the crisis together. Mara thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train that snowy day, alone and uncertain, hoping only for a job and a chance to prove herself. She'd found so much more community, purpose, and love with a man who saw her true worth. The fire had been a disaster, but from its ashes rose something new and stronger, like her own life, transformed by unexpected circumstances and the courage to embrace change. "I should get back to work," she said eventually, though she made no move to leave. "Stay a little longer," Calder urged. "The ledgers can wait." And so she stayed, keeping watch over this man who'd risked everything for others, who'd chosen her above prettier faces and easier paths. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The frontier had taught them both about resilience, about building something lasting from rough materials and determined spirits. Now they would build a life the same way with patience, courage, and the kind of love that, like the mountains themselves, endured. Word of Calder and Mara's understanding spread through both camps like wildfire through dry pine. By the time Calder's leg had healed enough for him to return to light duties, everyone from the cook's assistant to Hendricks himself seemed to know that the solitary surveyor was courting the lady bookkeeper. Most took it in stride frontier communities had seen stranger matches, but not everyone was pleased. The whispers started small, like the first wisps of smoke before a blaze. "Mighty convenient, sharing that room the night she arrived," someone muttered in the commissary. "Clever girl, getting him to set her up in that cabin," another added. Mara tried to ignore them, focusing on her work. But the comments grew bolder, especially after Rosa Lynn extended her stay at the southern camp, making frequent visits north, on business. One afternoon, Mara overheard two mill workers outside her cabin window. Bet she planned the whole thing. Heard she was desperate for work back east. What better way to secure a position than getting the boss's favorite surveyor sweet on her? One night was all it took. Must have been some night. Her hands trembled as she set down her pen. She'd faced gossip before, but this felt different, meaner, more pointed. When Calder arrived for their evening walk, he found her subdued. "What's wrong?" He'd recovered well, only a slight limp remaining from his injury. "Nothing, just tired." He studied her face. "Mara, talk to me." She tried to smile. "It's foolish, just some talk I overheard." His expression darkened. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that suggests I orchestrated our meeting, that I used that night at the boarding house to trap you somehow." She turned away. "Perhaps we should spend less time together. Let the talk die down." "No." "Calder, be reasonable. Your reputation can go hang. I've lived by these mountains' rules for 7 years. I've earned the right to court whom I please." He caught her shoulders gently, turning her to face him. "Has someone said something to you directly?" "Not directly, but I hear the whispers, see the looks." His jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." "No, you won't. That would only make it worse." She pulled free. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I did take advantage." "Stop!" His voice was sharp. "Don't you dare let their small minds make you doubt what we have." "But what if—" "What if nothing? I know the truth. You know the truth. That's all that matters." But it wasn't that simple. The next day, Mara found errors in her ledgers that hadn't been there before someone had been in her cabin. Tampering with her work. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make her look incompetent if she hadn't caught it. Then came the incident at the saloon. Calder had taken her to dinner in town, a public declaration of their courtship. They'd barely settled at their table when Bart Morrison, one of the mill foremen and a friend of Rosa Lynn's, approached, whiskey heavy on his breath. Well, the surveyor and his bookkeeper." He leered at Mara. "Tell me, Miss Callahan, do you charge by the night, or was that first one free?" Calder was on his feet before the words finished leaving Morrison's mouth. Only Mara's quick hand on his arm stopped him from throwing the first punch. Mr. Morrison? She said coolly. You're drunk and embarrassing yourself. Please leave. Embarrassing myself? That's rich. Coming from a woman who... Who what? Calder's voice was deadly quiet. Choose your next words very carefully. Morrison. The saloon had gone silent. Everyone watching. Morrison seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, but the whiskey made him foolish. Just saying what everyone's thinking. One night in a shared room and suddenly she's got a cabin, a job, and the camp's best surveyor dancing attendance. He swayed slightly. Must have been quite a performance. Calder moved so fast Mara barely saw it. One moment Morrison was standing. The next he was on the floor, blood streaming from his nose. Calder stood over him, fists clenched. Anyone else have something to say about Miss Callahan's honor? Silence greeted his challenge. Morrison groaned from the floor, making no attempt to rise. I thought not. Calder offered Mara his arm. Shall we take our dinner elsewhere? They left amid scattered applause and nervous mutters. Outside, Mara pulled him to a stop. You shouldn't have done that. Yes, I should have. I should have done it sooner. He flexed his bruised knuckles. I won't have anyone speaking of you that way. Violence won't stop the talk. Maybe not, but it'll make them think twice about voicing it in my presence. They walked toward the boarding house in tense silence. At the door, Mrs. Donnelly appeared, having already heard the news. About time someone shut Morrison's mouth, she declared. Man's been spreading poison for days. Rosa Lynn whispering in his ear like a snake. It's all right, Mara said wearily. I knew there would be talk. Talk is one thing, slander is another. Mrs. Donnelly fixed Calder with a stern look. You planning to make an honest woman of her, or just court her till kingdom come? Mrs. Donnelly, Mara protested. Don't you, Mrs. Donnelly me. If you two are serious, might be time to make it official. Take the wind out of these gossips' sails. After she bustled away, Calder turned to Mara. She's not wrong. We've barely been courting a month, and I've known since that first night that you were different. Special. He took her hands. I told you I don't do things halfway. I love you, Mara. I want to marry you. Not because of gossip, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Calder, I know it's fast, but is time really what matters? Some people court for years and never know each other like we do. She thought about those first nights in the boarding house, the immediate sense of recognition, of finding someone who understood. The weeks since had only deepened that connection. Where would we live? She asked, surprising herself with the practical question. His face lit up. I've been thinking about that. There's a piece of land north of here, near where I found that grove of old growth. Creek access, southern exposure, perfect for a cabin. I'd want to keep working, at least until children come. Of course. Wouldn't expect otherwise. And you'd have to stop throwing punches at everyone who insults me. I make no promises there. Despite everything, she laughed. You impossible man. Is that a yes? She looked at him, this man who'd shared his room, his food, his poetry, who'd rushed into fire for strangers and defended her honor with his fists, who saw her not as too serious or too plain, but as exactly right. Ask me properly, she said. Not here in the street, still angry from a fight? When you're calm and I'm certain it's not just protective instinct talking. He smiled, understanding. Fair enough, but know this, my mind won't change. A day, a week, a month from now, I'll still want you for my wife. That night, alone in her cabin, Mara sat by the window watching snow begin to fall. The gossip would continue. She knew Rosa Lynn wouldn't give up easily. There would be more whispers, more attempts to undermine her. But she thought about Calder's fierce protectiveness. Mrs. Donnelly's staunch support, the approving nods from some of the other women after the saloon incident. She wasn't as alone as she'd feared. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Mrs. Hollowell carrying a covered basket.
"Thought you might need some company,"
the older woman said, bustling inside.
"and some of my apple turnovers. Good for the soul after a trying day."
As they sat by the fire, sharing tea and pastries, Mrs. Hollowell patted Mara's hand.
"Don't let them chase you off. Dear, you've brought that man back to life. Everyone with eyes can see it." She smiled. "Besides, every good love story needs obstacles. Makes the happy ending sweeter."
"You think we'll have a happy ending. I know you will. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, and you look at him the same way." She chuckled. "Though maybe try to keep him from punching anyone else. Morrison had it coming, but we can't have him brawling his way through the whole camp." After Mrs. Hollowell left, Mara felt lighter. The gossip hadn't disappeared, but its power over her had diminished. Let them talk. She knew her own heart, and Calder's. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, warm in her little cabin with snow falling soft outside and the memory of Calder's fierce defense warming her heart, she felt ready to face them all. She'd come west seeking independence and found love instead. Or perhaps, she thought as she prepared for bed, she'd found both. Real love didn't diminish independence, it strengthened it, gave it purpose and depth. Whatever storms lay ahead, literal or figurative, she would weather them. Not alone, but alongside a man who saw her truth and valued it above all else. That was worth fighting for, worth a little gossip, worth everything. Spring arrived early that year, melting the mountain snow and filling the creeks with rushing water. The logging camp prepared for its busiest season, and Mara found herself overwhelmed with contracts, supply orders, and wage calculations. But her mind kept drifting to that morning a month ago when Calder had formally proposed. He'd taken her to the grove of ancient pines he'd fought to protect, spreading a blanket beneath trees that had stood for centuries. There, with sunlight filtering through branches older than memory, he'd knelt in the pine needles and asked her to be his wife. She'd said yes, of course, had known her answer since that night in the saloon when he defended her honor with his fists. Now, preparations were underway for a June wedding. Mrs. Hollowell had appointed herself chief organizer, while Mrs. Donnelly insisted on hosting the reception at the boarding house. Even Rosa Lynn had finally departed, apparently accepting defeat, though not before one last attempt to stir trouble. The memory still made Mara shake her head. Rosa Lynn had cornered her at the general store, all false sweetness and veiled threats.
"I hope you know what you're getting into," she'd said. "Cal can be so
intense. Some women find it overwhelming." "I find it honest," Mara had replied calmly.
"Something you might not recognize."
Rosa Lynn's perfect face had twisted briefly before resuming its mask. "Well, I suppose every man gets the wife he deserves."
"Yes,"
Mara had agreed.
"They do."
That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, life had settled into a rhythm of work and wedding planning, punctuated by Calder's visits and their evening walks. Today was special, though. The camp was hosting its spring celebration, a tradition marking the start of the logging season. Tables had been set up outside the commissary, laden with food. Musicians tuned their fiddles while children ran between the buildings, freed from winter's confinement. Mara wore her best dress, a deep copper color she'd made herself with fabric from town. It wasn't fancy by city standards, but Calder's eyes had gone wide when he saw her. "You're beautiful," he'd said simply, offering his arm. Now they stood together watching couples dance on the packed earth that served as a floor. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Dance with me," Calder said suddenly. "Here now." "Why not let them all see how proud I am to be with you?" They joined the other couples, Calder's hand warm on her waist as they moved to the fiddle music. Mara was aware of eyes on them, some approving, others still skeptical. But she found she didn't care. "Do you remember that first night?" Calder asked as they turned. You were so proper, so careful, sitting in that chair with your sewing, trying not to look at me. I was looking, she admitted, just trying to be subtle about it. And I was pretending to read that manual while really watching you work. He spun her gently. I think I started falling in love with you when you asked what I was reading. No one had asked me anything real in so long. For me, it was when you shared your food. Such a simple thing, but the way you divided everything exactly equally, making sure I had enough. She smiled up at him. Thomas would have eaten his fill and offered me the scraps, if anything. Thomas was a fool. The luckiest fool alive. If he hadn't been, I never would have come west, never would have met you. The song ended, but they stayed close, swaying slightly. Around them, the celebration continued: laughter, music, the clink of glasses raised in toasts. I have something to tell you, Mara said, or rather, show you. She led him to her cabin, where a wrapped package waited on the table. An early wedding gift, she explained as he opened it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, pristine pages waiting to be filled. On the cover, she'd had the leather worker emboss C. Boon, Forest Surveyor and Conservationist. Mara, he breathed, running his fingers over the letters. For your observations, your maps, your poetry. She moved closer. I thought you should have something befitting your work, something that honors what you do. He set the journal carefully aside and pulled her into his arms. How did I get so lucky? It wasn't luck, she said against his chest. It was a chimney fire and a boarding house with only one room. Best disaster that ever happened to me. They returned to the celebration as stars began appearing overhead. The dancing had grown livelier, and even usually stern Hendricks was laughing at something Mrs. Donnelly had said. Later, as the evening wound down, an unexpected voice called for attention. It was young Tim Sullivan, one of the men Calder had saved from the fire. His arm had healed, though he still carried scars on his hands. I want to make a toast, he said, raising his glass. To Calder Boon, who risked his life for strangers, and to Miss Callahan, who stayed by our sides through the worst of it. He looked directly at them. Some folks have had unkind things to say about how you two met, but I say anyone who can find love in this rough country deserves celebrating, not gossip. Here, here, others called out, raising their own glasses. Old Sam, the camp's most senior logger, stood next. I've been cutting timber for 40 years. Seen all kinds of people come through these camps. Takes a special kind of courage to leave everything behind and start fresh. Miss Callahan's got that courage. And Boon, well, he's been half ghost since he arrived, till she brought him back to the living. He lifted his drink. To new beginnings. More toasts followed, each warming Mara's heart. The community that had whispered behind her back was now celebrating alongside them. She realized this was what Calder had meant about earning your place not through perfection, but through perseverance. As the celebration finally ended and couples drifted away, Calder walked Mara back to her cabin one last time as an unmarried woman. In 3 weeks, she'd moved to the new cabin he was building on that beautiful piece of land by the creek. Are you happy? He asked at her door. More than I ever imagined possible. No regrets about leaving Chicago, about the gossip, about marrying a man who reads poetry to trees. She laughed. The only thing I regret is that we didn't have more nights in that boarding house room. They were educational. Educational, he raised an eyebrow. I learned that thunder isn't so frightening when you're not alone. That shared soup tastes better than a fancy meal. That sometimes the best conversations happen with a stranger who won't be a stranger for long. And I learned, he said softly, that I'd been hiding from life instead of living it. That solitude isn't strength when it's built on fear. That one night can change everything if you're brave enough to let it. They stood close in the starlight, neither wanting the evening to end. Tomorrow would bring more work, more wedding preparations, more of life's complications. But tonight, they had the peace of understanding, of being known and chosen. I love you, Mara said simply. Thank you for sharing your room that night. Thank you for needing it, he replied. Thank you for being too serious, too ambitious, too much of everything Thomas couldn't appreciate. Thank you for being exactly who you are. He kissed her then, sweet and full of promise under the vast Montana sky. When they parted, both were smiling. 3 more weeks, he said. 3 more weeks. And then we'll share more than just a room. We'll share a life. As Mara watched him walk away, whistling that familiar tune, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From a cramped room above a Chicago millinery shop to a cabin at the edge of wilderness. From loneliness to love. From surviving to thriving. She thought about that frightened, determined woman who'd stepped off the train in a snowstorm, hoping only for a chance to prove herself. How surprised she would have been to know what waited not just a job or independence, but a home, a community, a man who saw her truly. The lamp glowed warm in her window as she prepared for bed, its light a beacon in the darkness. Soon it would shine in a different window, in a home built by loving hands for a future shaped by shared dreams. But tonight, in the cabin that had been her first real home, Mara Callahan fell asleep smiling, grateful for chimney fires and housing shortages, for thunderstorms and spilled secrets, for all the unexpected moments that had led her to love. Outside, the mountains stood eternal guard, their peaks touched with starlight, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called a wild, free sound that spoke of home. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and give this video a like. And don't forget to hit that hype button to help more listeners discover this romantic frontier tale. Your support means the world and helps bring more of these historical love stories to life. Until next time, partners.